Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots, the Spectator's daily politics podcast. I'm Katy Balls and I'm joined by John McTernan and Kate Andrews. So, on Monday, Rachel Reeves stood up at the dispatch box and said, despite perhaps previously indicating there would be no need for additional tax rises, there could be more coming in autumn, and in the meantime, here are some spending cuts to boot. Kate, can you just bring listeners very quickly up to date on the main planks of what Rachel Reeves has announced so far?
So as you say, Katie, she's gone first with the spending cuts. So we're seeing a review of rail projects, which she says are overspent by £1 billion. Some changes to those projects, some scale back. She has scrapped the Rwanda scheme. This was all expected, but the surprise announcement from Rachel Reeves is that the winter fuel allowance will no longer be universal. You will have to be on some kind of pension credit or receiving some other kinds of means-tested benefit in order to qualify for the winter fuel allowance, which is a saving of an estimated £1.5 billion. Now, this is to fill in a £20 billion fiscal black hole that the Chancellor says the Tories left her in what she's calling a cover-up. And I think the debate in the coming days, albeit a debate that's hard for the Tory party to have with no leader and no real sense of direction yet, is whether or not this was a cover-up, deliberate, as the Chancellor said it was, or whether or not this is a matter of political choices. Of course, Rachel Reeves has decided to go with the independent body reviews for pay, which is costing billions of pounds. She says that the Tories, that was a cover-up too. They weren't preparing for the proper pay rises. A lot of people are going to argue, no, that's governing, that's difficult choices, that's not a cover-up, that's just choosing to prioritize something over something else.
And on that, John, Rachel Reeves obviously pointed to overspend on asylum as one example of how this fiscal black hole was much worse than she could have anticipated pre-election. But those pay public body recommendations that she has chosen to accept, that is an active choice. And it is also an active choice to give junior doctors a 22% pay rise. So do you think this is smart politics from Rachel Reeves, even if it's not perhaps entirely truthful?
Well, look, I think it was truthful. And the total gap that was found by the Treasury exercise, by Rachel's Treasury-led exercise, was £35 billion. But then she took off that an account for reserves, took off that an account for some of the overspend that Treasury don't believe will happen, around £7 billion. And so I think the anger was real because the gap was real. And the fact that, that immediately after the statement, about an hour after the statement, the OBR said they're going to be investigating how they came to give them such misleading information for the preparation for the spring budget. I think that shows you that Rachel's touched a nerve and she's found something real. And for going forward, she's going to legislate for a different discipline on chancellors. She genuinely believes that the government played fast and loose with the numbers. I think she made the point pretty well yesterday, and it is an important thing for her to do, to say we had this inheritance from those people, and she wants to tie this deficit around the necks of the outgoing government. On the specifics of pay, there's only needs to be such a big pay settlement for the junior doctors because the dispute was allowed to go on for so long. It would have been it's not a 1 year pay deal in that sense, and doctors are being poached by countries all around the world, particularly Australia. And finally, on the pay settlements. The pay review body settlements are accepted. They're there as a form of arbitration, so you don't have industrial disputes. So the government, the previous government, the Tories, they accepted the pay settlements. So accepting a pay settlement is not a change of policy. It should have been budgeted for. It should have been predicted. The government should have had an awareness in its budget. If it had been going to be carrying on for the rest of the year, it could have done. So I think every single point that Rachel made was fair, and the whole thing is, this is to put a reputation on Rishi Sunak, on Jeremy Hunt, and the previous Prime Ministers and Chancellors of the last Tory government.
And John, obviously part of the reason she's going to want to do that is because, in a way, this is just the beginning of some quite difficult choices. And we're now expecting a budget in the autumn. I was sat watching her press conference in the Treasury last night, and while Rachel Reeves did not say, yes, there are definitely tax rises, it was almost every way you could say that without saying it, completely directly. So where do you think the burden's going to fall? Because something I think we've spoken about previously on this podcast, and also I think you wrote about for the magazine, is that if Labour were to take government, there is going to be a different emphasis in the sense of who is the main, Labour voter they're appealing to, where do MPs think things should go. So actually, do you think we're about to see an intergenerational shake-up when it comes to government choices and who it benefits?
Look, I think we saw the first sign of an intergenerational shift in Rachel's announcement yesterday that she was going to restrict the winter fuel allowance to those who get means-tested benefits. Now, there's more than one way of arguing this point. The triple lock, which has been in place since the coalition government, the triple lock has meant that the state pensions increased much faster than it would have done if it had been maintained only in line with prices. And so it's had a boost, and that boost is probably larger since 2010, and it's going to carry on with the current Labour government. A bigger boost than the totality of the winter fuel allowance. That winter fuel allowance was one of the many devices that Gordon Brown invented to compensate for the fact that the index linking meant that 1 year there was a 75p increase in the pension. So he was buying out a public relations failure, and so that I think was a sign, though, that it's going to be winter for boomers. So all of the things that boomers have expected all through their lifestyle, that they get the upside of government spending, they get the benefit of free tuition, they get the benefit of house price increases. Maybe things are going to shift, and the generational focus is going to be on younger voters. They are both people who voted overwhelmingly for Labour, but they're also people who voted overwhelmingly for other parties to the left of the Labour Party. So there's a genuine political contest around that. And I think if you rule out the taxes on working people, you're ruling out taxes in effect on earned income. You're not ruling out taxes on unearned income. And I think that shift to wealth taxes in whatever form, whether it's carried interest, there's a consultation this morning, I think, being issued on carried interest, consultation on CGT, some kind of tax on housing that rebalances local government finance and council tax, and the windfall that people who own their own properties have had in the last 15, 20 years in the UK. There's all kinds of areas, but if you don't do tax on working people, you do taxes on wealth, taxes on unearned income, taxes on housing, taxes on land, in that space, and taxes, of course, on pensions, in the sense that pensions have generous tax reliefs at the moment, and so you focus when you rule out 2/3 of taxes as a possibility. You focus on others, and then you're exactly right. There is a narrative around about rebalancing between the generations, and it's so that kind of thing I think is good. And I suppose the underlying as well, you saw some capital projects cancelled yesterday. Boris Johnson's 40 new hospitals, of which one wing has been built. And so that too, I think, will be the traditional Treasury way of removing a capital project to balance a revenue underspend or revenue overspend. And I think that has different implications for growth. But the taxation shift is definitely generational in my view.
So winter for boomers, summer for millennials / Gen Z, Kate, potentially.
If they build some homes, it's a big if.
Summer that's taken a long time, to be fair. Probably a bit like July felt in the UK. But I suppose, Rachel Reeves has talked a lot about how her government is going for growth. Treasury will be more growth orientated than those that came before. It's almost occasionally sounded almost Trussite in the number of times they use the G word. Do you think any of the measures, not so much I suppose the ones we just had, though there is some infrastructure cancelling of plans, but potential tax rises on, as John was just saying, things like capital gains tax, potentially more on assets. Does any of that jar against the growth agenda?
I think some of it does. I think even what we saw yesterday, it does raise questions. The Labour government has suggested that it really wants investment in capital projects. Now, they have been pretty honest about the fact that the state, the taxpayer, doesn't really have the money to do it at the moment, and they're going to need private money and private investment, which I guess justifies or fits into their narrative of why they've decided to reassess some of these capital projects as of yesterday. I think the bigger question mark is over these pay raises and the 22% rise for junior doctors. I think a lot of people will be sitting there saying, look, they deserve it. They absolutely are underpaid. They should get more money. But why it's not tied to, say, some kind of outcome, an increase in productivity in the public sector, for example, which has fallen off a cliff since the pandemic? Why is it not tied to something around the NHS wait lists, which we know people are still really, really struggling with? The fact that it was just sort of a blanket, we're going to find the money to do the pay raises, but also we have this £20 billion fiscal hole. I think that's where it starts to jar a bit. I mean, housing remains a very positive narrative. We're still waiting to see the details. I think we're getting some of those, we're getting more details this week. But yeah, I think Rachel Reeves is going to have to be quite careful about her growth narrative alongside tax rises. There are some taxes that are much better to avoid than others when it comes to growth. She has had an incredible political moment this week. I mean, I thought, if I were the Tory sitting across from her yesterday, I would have been quite terrified, actually.
Yeah, Jeremy Hunt didn't look very happy.
He looked furious. Of course, she's directly attacking his budgets, right? But, I think I do disagree with John slightly in the sense that I just think there is more nuance to this £20 billion figure. There's absolutely no doubt that the Tories have been coming up very close, uncomfortably close to their fiscal rule over the past few budgets. And I think you could definitely make the case that there's been a lack of responsibility in being so close to your targets, still promising tax cuts, putting all your spending cuts in the next parliament. But this was all on the table before the election. The OBR was flagging this, saying, wow, the Tories are implying that you're going to have billions of pounds missing from departmental spending in the next parliament. That's interesting. The Institute for Fiscal Studies was making this case throughout the election. There were a lot of people putting these points to Labour and the Tories. How are you going to fill the fiscal black hole that is between 10 to 20 billion pounds in the next parliament? No one wanted to answer it for very obvious political reasons. So the fact that it's new information, I think, is where most of the pushback comes from. But it doesn't change the fact that Rachel Reeves has had a very powerful moment. I think she was incredibly formidable. She came across as somebody who was angry for the right reasons, angry on behalf of the country. The Tories are still struggling to come up with their response. But in terms of what Labour needs to do, and that is to get sustained higher growth in the UK and for people to feel it before the next election, that's going to come down to their own public policy. And yeah, Katie, I think you're completely right to flag that perhaps some of what's already been announced might not sit quite right with that growth narrative.
And just finally, John, just the other week we were talking about the row over the two-child benefit cap. Now, 7 Labour MPs had the whip suspended for a time-limited period of 6 months and then for review. But there was clearly more Labour MPs who would like it to be lifted and are pushing so. The Child Poverty Task Force is viewed as the mechanism to get there. But when you speak to MPs, they all think that is going in the autumn budget. Do you think Rachel Reeves can really afford it, about £3 billion, given the cuts and the tax rises she needs to do to apparently fill this hole?
So politically, Rachel can't afford not to lift the two-child limit. People held the line in the King's speech, partly because it's so symbolic. Only 7 revolted. Remember that on the third reading of the long parent benefits cuts, there was a big revolt. On the first reading, there wasn't. So quite often revolts can build and build and build. It was in the November of the Blair government that there was actually the biggest revolt on welfare cuts. And I think, is it to stick to fiscal rules or is it to alleviate poverty? And I think that's the fight within the PLP. They believe that it will be lifted. They believe that Rachel's committed, the government's committed to alleviating child poverty, and the big question is, can you make it irreversible? Because child poverty was halved under New Labour, but it went up massively under the Tory governments from 2010 to 2014, 2010 to 2024. The question in the mind of Rachel has to be, and the whole government, I think, how can we show fiscal discipline? How can we stick to our course without breaking the politics of the Labour Party? And I think that's the issue, which is that in politics, in the end, politics comes before rules, and any mechanistic application of this to the two-child limit will be not just damaging for the Labour Party and Labour government, it will be emblematic of what Labour's approach to managing the economy, managing the state will be, and it would be a trade-off too far, I believe, for most MPs. Not saying there'll be a mass revolt, but I think that people will go, we genuinely believed it would be lifted. So I think if there's a genuine expectation of tax increases, they're probably in the spaces that we've talked about. And there's a genuine expectation of some relief. The two-child limit is that area, and obviously people are very happy with the lifting of the pay awards, which I do think is a presage to, you can move on public sector productivity if you're not punitive on pay, and I think that there's a kind of a clear philosophy of managing government which is emerging from the things that Keir and Rachel are saying and doing, and there's also a clear politics, that taxation on wealth and that that alleviating child poverty. Those things, the shapes that are emerging that will probably set the parameters for the government going forward.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kate. And thank you for listening.